Hello and welcome to our third and final installation of AARP Indiana's Social Security Awareness Series. I'm Robin Grant, an AARP Indiana volunteer with the Indianapolis team. The goal of this virtual event series has been twofold. First, to provide you with an opportunity to hear from the Social Security Administration on information and resources to help you get the most out of this incredibly important program. And second, to empower you to be a champion for Social Security and its future. In our session tonight, titled AARP's Guiding Principles and Commitment to Preserving the Social Security Program, we'll touch on that second point in a much more direct manner. This evening, we'll hear from Tom Nichols, Government Affairs Director at AARP, and we'll discuss AARP's dedication to preserving the Social Security Program and its guiding principles. This, joining Tom, I should say, is AARP Indiana's Directors of Community Engagement, Emily Gorman and Addison Pollock, who will facilitate the conversation and relay any questions you have. So I want to cover just a couple of housekeeping items before we kick off the program. Number one, we encourage you to ask questions. And to do so, please use the Q&A function to enter any questions you may have during tonight's program, and we'll do our very best to answer as many questions as time allows. And number two, a very common question we've received throughout this series is if these webinar episodes will be recorded and available for future viewing. The answer is yes. You can find recordings of the previous events at www.aarp.org/IN. And tonight's event is being recorded and will be available in the next week. So with that, let's get started with our program. I want to introduce our special guest, Tom Nichols. Tom is a Government Affairs Director at AARP with over 20 years of federal and state retirement policy experience. He currently serves AARP's nearly 37 million members and all older Americans nationwide as a federal lobbyist and policy expert on Social Security. Prior to joining AARP in 2009, Tom served for 6 years as a staffer in the United States House of Representatives for Congressman Paul Kanjorski of Pennsylvania. Tom holds a BS in Quantitative Business Analysis from Pennsylvania State University and an MA in Political Management from George Washington University. So now that you know a little bit about Tom, I'll hand things over to him, Emily, and Addison to kick us off. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was wonderful. And thank you for being here with us tonight. And welcome, everybody. Thank you, Addison and Tom, for joining me. How is everyone?
Good, thank you, Emily. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you, Addison?
Hanging in there. I'm doing just fine. It's been a really good Monday, so looking forward to tonight.
It has been a good Monday. It's been a busy Monday. I feel like it flew by. So as Robin said, we're set up for a really wonderful, informative episode tonight. And just one quick thing I did want to just reiterate, if anybody has any questions throughout, please, we encourage you to use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And that will just allow us as presenters to see your questions as they come in and get to them as we go, instead of kind of filtering through the chat function. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Addison, do you want to kick us off with what we're going to cover this evening?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Emily. So for those who have joined us for the first two installations of this webinar series, we talked a lot about the practical nature of Social Security and how it relates to you as a someone who will draw Social Security, draw down Social Security in the future, or you currently are, asking some of those technical questions. Tonight, we're going to take a more macro view of everything, and we're going to look at Social Security, at large. So like the policy that surrounds Social Security and why AARP fights for Social Security every day. So we couldn't ask for a better guest to join us. So Tom is with us, and we'll be answering our questions, your questions. So just encourage you to have those come in the queue. But just to kick us off, I just want to frame up the conversation and ask you, Tom, about your role and responsibility with AARP. Can you tell us a little bit about your daily job?
Sure, Addison. So first and foremost, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Robin for the wonderful introduction. And like I said, really pleased to be here tonight. Ironically, so I'm based in Washington, D.C. Although ironically, I just returned from Indiana last night. One of my best friends lives outside of Anderson, and I spent the last several days in Indiana. So it's I'm pleased to sort of continue my several days off in Indiana with this webinar tonight. So thanks for having me again. So as I mentioned, so I'm based in Washington, D.C. I am what many may believe as what many may note as an evil lobbyist. So I lobby on behalf of AARP and all older Americans in Congress and in the executive branch as well on the policy priorities of AARP. And the one in particular that I work on is Social Security. So a lot of what I do is to pay attention, I think, to what's going on in Congress in terms of what bills are introduced, what folks are talking about, pay attention to what's going on at the Social Security Administration as well, and sort of always be there to kind of relay or to talk about or to advocate for AARP's preferred policy no matter what comes up on Social Security. So that's generally my job, is to kind of always be paying attention to what's going on and always be there communicating with elected officials how AARP feels about things and why.
Amazing. And I can say, as an AARP staffer, I think we all feel very lucky to have you on our team and as a resource to go to whenever we're working on things in state. Very helpful. So with what Addison mentioned earlier, about why AARP is fighting for this every day and why this is important to us, I wanted to kick things off with our first question for you, and wondered if you could dive into how important Social Security is to older Hoosiers and their families, and talk a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Emily. So, on this question, it's really hard to overstate, frankly, how important Social Security is to all Americans and all Hoosiers, including current retirees, right? It really is hard to overstate. I think what I usually like to do is to start with just the sheer numbers of folks that we're talking about, right? So even just in Indiana, you're talking about 1.4 million Hoosiers who are currently receiving Social Security benefits, right? And so that's just one way to look at it, is just the sheer number of folks who are receiving benefits. And then you have to realize sort of that we can understand that there are so many folks out there who really rely on their Social Security benefits to make sure that they make ends meet every month, to be able to buy the things that they need to buy and live in their retirement years with, with some level of financial security. So it's again, it's very hard to overstate how important it is. Average benefits for folks, for retirees in Indiana, it's only around about $1,886 a month, or $22,600 a year. But again, nonetheless, folks rely really heavily on that. From a sort of a macro look, as Addison mentioned, Social Security benefits actually bring in about $29 billion a year into Indiana's economy, which is substantial. And you can look at it another way too, is to sort of talk about how much Social Security how many people Social Security lifts out of poverty every, in Indiana. So over a 3-year stretch where we have numbers from 2018 to 2022, or I'm sorry, 2020, about 300,000 Indiana residents were lifted out of poverty because of Social Security. Basically, about 36% of the state's residents who are 65 and older would be in poverty were it not for their Social Security benefits. And with those Social Security benefits, that falls down to 8.2%. So you can really see, again, sort of even just in those areas, just how important Social Security is. But these are those macro numbers. See, all you have to do is talk to folks and hear about just how important Social Security is to, again, just every month getting that guaranteed benefit that they earned after a lifetime of hard work, and how important it is for folks to sort of have that Social Security benefit and be able to use it all the time and know it's coming in, again, in order to buy the things that they need in order to live.
Yeah, certainly. You talk about the importance of the program and what it means to folks who rely on it. Do you know the rough percentage of Indiana retirees who rely solely on Social Security as their primary source of income?
I do. Yep, absolutely. So we look at it from two different ways, right? So for the folks who solely rely on it for their income, right? So about 17% of Hoosiers who are 65 and older live in families who rely on Social Security for nearly all of their income. So again, a large number, right? And then we look at it also in terms of that there's about 44% of Hoosiers who are 65 and older who live in families that rely on Social Security for at least half of their income. So again, there's just a huge number of folks who are relying on Social Security, certainly for at least half of their income. But again, that sort of 17% that relies on it for nearly all of their income in retirement. So again, just how important Social Security is to those families.
Yeah, those numbers are kind of wild to think about. And so I wondered, we see a lot of stuff in the news and, you read a lot of stuff, but I wondered if you could just dive into a little bit of what the current financial status is of Social Security. And is it really going broke? Like, what do we need to know here?
Yep, absolutely. So actually, this is a well-timed conversation today, actually, because so every year, so first and foremost, there's this group of folks in government they're called Social Security trustees. They pay attention to the financial health of the program, and every year they release a report that looks at the financial health of Social Security. And that Social Security trustees report came out today. So breaking a little bit of news for folks. So when they look at Social Security, what they say is, okay, so right now, without any changes whatsoever, Social Security can continue to pay 100% of promised benefits until 2035. Okay, and then after that, if Congress doesn't act, Social Security can continue to pay about 83% of promised benefits moving forward all the way out. I think it goes down to about 73% in 2098, but it's many, many decades of about 83% of promised benefits. So like I said, 100% of promised benefits until 2035. And then after that, even if Congress doesn't act, can still pay 83% of promised benefits for decades. So I hope that answers the question of is it going broke, right? And the answer is no, it's not going broke. I think that people's definition of broke tends to be that it has zero money at all and that it sort of ceases to exist, right? But Social Security never does that, and I'll explain why. So the main way that Social Security gets its funding, the way that the money comes into Social Security is through the payroll tax, or it's called the FICA tax, right? So as long as there are folks who are working and paying that FICA tax, there's always money coming into Social Security, right? And so, all right, so then the question is, why is there this 2035 date? So back in 1983, when Congress last made changes to Social Security, what they realized was that they saw a very large generation of folks who was going to be retiring, right? So the boomer generation. And what they did, they actually looked forward and they said, okay, we're going to start bringing in more in Social Security than is necessary to pay benefits at the time. And we'll take those excess dollars and we'll put them on the side. And then when we need to start using them, then we'll start using them, right? And so basically what has happened is that, so you always have this FICA tax that's coming in. And for many, many years, you could just sort of pay Social Security benefits just on the FICA taxes. But they knew that at some point in the future, which actually was probably about either 2010, depending on 2010 or 2021, whether or not you want to look at non-interest income versus interest income, it's too detailed. The FICA tax by itself was enough. And then once that stopped being the case, which like I said, was either 2010 or 2021, then they started to tap the reserves in order to supplement the FICA taxes that were coming in to continue to pay 100% of promised benefits, right? So right now we're in this period of time where FICA taxes are coming in and they bring in the vast majority of money. And for any shortfall, you start tapping those reserves, okay? And you can do that, you can keep doing that until 2035 when the reserves itself is the thing that goes away. The FICA taxes never do. It's just what I like to think of as sort of the side pile of reserve money that goes away, right? Without any changes. So when that happens, then you just have the FICA taxes coming in, which is why you're able to continue to pay 83% of promised benefits for the foreseeable future. So that's the current status of the program. It's absolutely not going broke. The issue is that without any changes from Congress, if we get to that 2035 date and nothing happens, then there would be a mandatory, what would be 17% reduction in benefits for everybody, because there's only enough money coming in with the FICA tax in order to pay for 83% of benefits.
That's impressive. Thank you for breaking that down, Tom. It's you don't really get that sort of coverage in the national news, just breaking it down that way. So appreciate that.
Hopefully I have a tendency of getting real technical real fast, so I hope I didn't.
No, you did not. You gave us just enough technical expertise to help us along. This question is not super technical because you've already talked about the implications for the program after 2035. So I know you don't have a crystal ball, but will Congress act in the face of what we're up against?
Yeah, so yes, they absolutely will. I really do believe that. So Social Security has faced a solvency problem in the past. Like I said, so back in 1983 was the last time that they made sort of big changes to Social Security in order to address the long-term solvency of the program, right? And now, back in 1983, we were about maybe 6 months to a year out from that sort of mandatory benefit reduction that I talked about, which is sort of the problem now, right? So, but Congress did act. And I truly believe that they all recognize, of course, that we're facing this sort of mandatory 17% reduction in benefits starting in 2035, as far as the projections are right now. No one wants to see that happen. So I firmly believe that Congress will, of course, act. Now, at the same time, I also think that it's really incumbent on AARP and all older Americans, and frankly, American workers as well, to try to encourage Congress to act sooner rather than later, because the sooner they'll act, the smaller the changes would have to be. Now we're getting relatively close where even any changes have to be relatively large, but it's a little bit like saving for retirement, is that the earlier you start, the sort of smaller you would have to the smaller savings that they add up over time. And the longer you wait for savings for retirement, the larger the savings has to be in order to, have a secure retirement. So, so the sooner they act, the better. AARP is always calling on Congress to act as soon as possible, and it's always helpful for folks to also encourage their members of Congress to shore up Social Security's long-term solvency and address benefit adequacy as soon as possible.
Amazing. And your breakdown from the previous question was the best breakdown I've heard. And like you just made it so understandable. So thank you for that. I just wanted to make sure I said that. I did want to ask about solutions and kind of shift to that side of things. So I wondered if you could dive into a little bit of what some of the common policy options that there are to make Social Security solvent, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'll put them into there's essentially one could argue that there are basically three categories of changes that you could make. The first, of course, well, however you depend to order it. One, of course, is to bring in more money into the system, right? I mean, it's a program that relies on funding, and so in order to extend the solvency of the program, you can certainly do things that would bring in more revenue into the system, right? Of course, Social Security is also a benefit payment program, right? Like benefits go out of the system into people's pockets. And so another way is to adjust those benefits. And frankly, when I talk about adjusting benefits, typically in order to have a positive impact on solvency, you would want to make changes to slow those benefits going out as fast, and so basically benefit reductions. It's another category of potential options. I think the most likely approach, because I think in Congress, and particularly for changes to Social Security, you would tend to have some type of package of changes that may have both of revenue increases, some type of benefit adjustments, and potentially even some benefit enhancements. That's probably a third category. Benefit enhancements tend to have a negative impact on solvency while they have a positive impact on people. And so those would cost something, but while you're in there and you're already bringing in perhaps more revenue into the system, you might actually have some room to make some type of improvement as well. So those are sort of the three big categories. And then I can tell you about, so I think some of the big sort of topics under each category, right? So, so for instance, starting with the revenue raisers, I think most folks might know that there is a cap on how much wages where you pay taxes on for Social Security, right? So when I was talking about those FICA taxes before, the specifics is that an employee and an employer both pay 6.2% of taxes on income up to $168,600. And that $168,600 is something called the cap, or the taxable maximum. So what you could do, of course, is you could raise that $168,600 to something else, right? You could, there are folks that talk about maybe raising it to where the tax would apply to wages above 250,000, above 400,000, eliminate the cap entirely. And so all wages would be subject to Social Security taxes. So I think that there are several ways that you could adjust that cap that would, of course, bring in more revenue, right? Now, actually, let me back up and tell you too, is that all of these options, there isn't necessarily an easy one. These are always going to come with pluses and minuses that need to be really thoroughly looked at, right? So for instance, if you, just as a technical thing, if you were to eliminate the cap entirely, so Social Security is earned benefits, right? Is that you earn your benefits based on the amount of money that based on your contributions into the system. So if you all of a sudden have billionaires paying taxes on all the way up to all of their wages, you could at some point see really, really large Social Security checks coming back out of that, which I don't think a lot of people necessarily want to see either, because I think they'll start asking, why does Warren Buffett need that monster Social Security check? Well, because it's based on what he put in. So if you don't do some type of an adjustment as well, then that can come with consequences, right? So another possible thing that you could do would be, as I mentioned, so it's 6.2% on employers and employees. That's called the rate. That 6.2% could be adjusted to something else, right? It could be 6.5% or 7.2%, or it could be whatever you wanted it to be, right? And so because that's a tax on American workers, so that would apply to about 183 million current American workers, where they would be paying more into Social Security because again, you're going from a 6.2% up to some other percentage, right? Which would obviously, of course, bring in more revenue into the system and have a positive impact on solvency. And then I think one other thing that folks seem to be talking about lately is you could do sort of new sort of taxes as well, right? I've seen things like where you would have some type of maybe 12.4% taxes on net investment income, both for maybe high income individuals or for corporations, taxes on S corporations, other sort of ways that Social Security doesn't have as a revenue stream, sort of bring in those other types of revenue, right? And then I think on the other side, so on the benefit reduction side, or benefit adjustment, however you would want to call it, raising the retirement age, right? So that seems to be one that's talked about often. Right now, for everybody born after 1960, your full retirement age is 67. And then if you were born sort of before 1960, chances are good your full retirement age is somewhere in the 66 years plus a certain number of months, depending on when you were actually born, right? So there are a lot of arguments that say that because people are living longer and potentially working longer, that one of the things you could also do would be to raise the retirement age. So to take it from where it is now, 67, to some other age, right? You could take it to 68, 69, whatever that happens to be. Again, we start getting into that yes, it sounds right that people are living longer and that some people are working longer. I think we have to realize that not everybody is working longer. That unfortunately, I think well, not unfortunately, I think number one, there's a lot of folks that work in physically demanding jobs where it would be very difficult to ask them to continue to work. I think, unfortunately, God forbid, but a lot of people unfortunately become disabled at some point too, through no fault of their own, and that tends to occur sort of in your later 50s or maybe your early 60s or even before, of course. But there are complications, of course, to raising the retirement age that just have to be understood. But again, it's something that's discussed, right? I think, as I mentioned earlier, about for instance, this could be not just because you eliminated the cap, where you have really high income folks paying a lot into Social Security. There are folks who say that higher income folks shouldn't get any Social Security, right? It's called means testing Social Security. So if you have substantial means outside of Social Security, some folks say you shouldn't get your Social Security. So it's another way of sort of changing the benefits, I think, for higher income folks. And I think that one of the things to consider there is, again, I think a lot of the popularity of Social Security has to do with the fact that it's an earned benefit, that people have worked their entire lives and they've paid into the program. And that turns into really strong support for the program. So you have to think, do you want to cut the link between the contributions and benefits back? It's just something to consider. And then one other way that gets talked about often is sort of how annual COLAs are calculated, right? This gets very detailed. I'm very sorry. There's basically a way that would essentially make the COLA less generous. I shouldn't say less generous. I should basically say less, that the COLA wouldn't be as much as it would otherwise be, because right now they use something called the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers in order to figure out what the inflation is. And there's something called chained CPI, which would largely typically sort of result in a lower measure of inflation, which then results in a lower measure of COLA, because COLAs are based on inflation. So another thing that folks talk about. And then lastly, I'm sorry, I know I've been talking a lot. One of the hazards of being a lobbyist is more folks, I think, lately are talking about bringing general revenue into Social Security, right? So Social Security is not financed by general revenue. As I mentioned earlier, it's financed largely by the FICA taxes, which are payroll taxes, not income taxes, right? So it's largely financed by payroll taxes and also the interest on the trust funds that I'll get into in a little bit. But it's separate from general revenue, right? So general revenue is when we all pay our taxes on April 15th, and that money goes to the government. That goes into general revenue, and it funds basically all the other parts of the government. Social Security is separate from that, but there are folks who are talking about potentially using general revenue and putting that into Social Security to shore it up as far as its solvency is concerned. So those tend to be, now I could be missing some. Listen, I'm trying not to spend everyone's evenings on every possible solvency option, but that tends to be, I think, some of, maybe many of the big ones.
Yeah, absolutely. That was very thorough, and we appreciate it. So thank you for that, Tom. As you mentioned, there's no easy solution, right? None of those solutions are necessarily easy. And rather than adopting like a single, policy prescription for addressing Social Security, AARP sort of operates on principles for protecting and saving Social Security. So can you talk a little bit about what those principles for protecting and saving that program, the program is for generations to come?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I want to start with, before I even get into principles necessarily, is to sort of talk about the fact that how important this issue is to AARP, right? And to all older Americans, and to those who are also currently contributing to the system as well. It's incredibly important. It touches the lives of so many people. This is a huge policy issue, and one that AARP is absolutely committed to as one of our most important, if not our most important. I'm a little bit biased since I do the issue, but one of our most important, if not the most important issue that we work on, right? And protecting and saving Social Security is and always has been one of our top legislative priorities, right? Older Americans, current workers, they care about the program deeply, and we want to make sure that generations of Americans can continue to count on Social Security, much like previous generations have, right? Social Security's been around for 88 years, and we want to make sure that it's around, and it always will be around, but that it's always there in a really adequate way for current retirees, either now or in the future. We want to make sure it's there for the next 88 years and more, right? I mentioned it's not going broke, as some argued, but Congress does need to act, and we are always encouraging Congress to act sooner rather than later, to do it in a bipartisan way, and to make sure that they protect and save Social Security for the long term, and to keep the promises that have been made to both current and future Social Security beneficiaries, right? So I think when we get into the principles, I think we, first and foremost, that any sort of solvency plan should do a couple things in the 30,000 foot level, right? It should, in fact, extend the solvency of the program, but it's not just about solvency either. It's also about benefit adequacy, right? To be honest, I can make Social Security solvent by doing nothing, because it just automatically, in 2035, it always stays solvent in that, but it doesn't stay to the point where it continues to pay 100% of promised benefits. So solvency isn't necessarily the only objective. It's also about benefit adequacy and the impact that those benefits have on people's lives, right? So that's the first thing, is to realize that any sort of solvency package needs to have a positive impact on solvency, but also needs to take into consideration and really focus on benefit adequacy as well, right? I think that other types of principles that we have are that Social Security should sort of maintain the fundamental character that it currently has. right, is that I think that, again, it's a really very popular program and one that maintains popular support from just vast numbers of folks, regardless of political party. It really doesn't matter. It's a really popular program in the mid 80s and above as far as popularity, regardless of whether or not people feel that, you know, people are Democrats, Republicans, independents. It really doesn't matter. There's this broad popular support for the program. So I think reaffirming Social Security's fundamental character is another part of the principles that we have, right? It should be a stable foundation for retirement. You should have this partnership between employees and employers and the government that sort of maintains the structure of Social Security, right? We haven't talked about it really all that much, but there are other benefits in Social Security like survivors benefits and disability benefits that also need to stick around as well, right? And again, there should be this earned benefit part of it, right? That you're contributing to the program and therefore you earn benefits out of it, right? Now, at the same time, we also think that, so for social, I mentioned earlier that there are so many folks who rely really heavily on Social Security as maybe their sole source of income in retirement. We should really keep those folks in mind, in particular when we're talking about solvency packages, right? I had mentioned before that depending on the solvency solution you choose, it tends to impact different people, right? So for instance, raising the cap above $168,600, that of course, by definition, it affects those making above $168,600. If you were to use the 6.2% increasing the rate, that applies to 183 million workers and their employers. So it just applies differently, right? It applies to different folks. And like I said, I think that one of the groups of folks that we should be particularly concerned about are the folks who really rely really heavily on Social Security. So that should be another key part, is understanding how any solvency package affects every group of folks that are out there, including and especially the folks who are really rely on Social Security very heavily. I think I had mentioned, like I said before, is that this should be, you know, Social Security should continue to have this relationship between work and the benefits that you get out, right? That's key to the program. Again, for Social Security retirement benefits, for disability benefits, that's workers contributing to a system that they then are able to collect benefits out of. That's absolutely true, I think, for survivors and spouses as well, is that they you know, are either maybe the widow or the widower, or just this, or the spouse of a worker who spent their whole lives contributing to Social Security as well. And so there's always this relationship between work and the benefits that you get out, right? And I think maybe one more is we should look at and have whatever changes sort of understand, like, and reflect the current workforce as well too, right? And I think that a lot of this gets into, again, we should see what's happening with longevity. We should see that there are some folks who are working and living longer. We should see that perhaps that there are, well, not perhaps, but there are certainly others who are not, and make sure we take those things into consideration as well. So I think that's a lot of the principles that we tend to use. I think that one of the things that we would really do, I mentioned it before, is that chances are good there's going to be some type of, there will be multiple changes in one bill. So you always want to look at not only, yes, absolutely, all of those individual things and how they affect people, but also looking at it in its totality as well. And so there's sort of two ways to judge it. And I think we want to do both, right? Is to understand all the specifics in it, but then also understand it from a macro or a totality kind of a way.
Thank you, Tom. That was super helpful. And I think really important to understand AARP's view on this as well. So thank you for diving into that. We do have a few audience questions coming in that I might just get to one of them if we have time. And this does go back to the solvency question and the question about, is Social Security really going broke? The first question I wanted to ask is from an audience member who says, how does population decline affect that reduction? And how does this reverse itself with the increasing birth rates and increased immigration? So that goes back to the question we were asking earlier.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question and totally
Yeah.
spot on, right? So the big drivers of this 2035 insolvency date is a couple things. Is first off, so for a long time, the United States, much like other industrialized countries, they have sort of a lowering birth rate, right? And so because the vast majority of how Social Security gets its money is because workers are working and they're contributing to the Social Security program, the lower the birth rate, the fewer workers there are, right? Eventually. And so, yeah, so that absolutely has a big part, right? So demographics is a big component of this. So lower birth rates, so fewer workers. And then we also have a large generation of folks who are retiring, right, as well. So you have a larger number of folks who are collecting benefits. So when you sort of combine those, now this was all expected too, by the way, right? It wasn't unexpected. Now, granted, we still have this 2035 issue, but it wasn't like it came out of nowhere. They were actually trying to anticipate it, which is part of those 1983 changes that I mentioned before about bringing in more revenue than was necessary. But demographics is huge, right? So fewer number of workers, larger number of retirees, and also many retirees, thank goodness, they're living longer too. So longevity also has an impact. Now, if you talk about how to maybe if we have increasing birth rates, or let's say that there is sort of higher levels of immigration, then that tends to add workers to this equation. So yeah, so you would so if lower workers lowers solvency, then more workers increases it.
That's great. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And Tom, I'm going to take another audience member question. And I think this is a pretty straightforward one. What was the previous forecast date of when Social Security would reduce to 80% before the 2035 update?
Yeah, it was 2034.
Perfect. So we're just pushed back 1 year. So that's
1 year,
that's
yes. There doesn't tend to be big swings anymore when so all this is based on projections, right? You're projecting sort of how long people are living, how many people are working. You're projecting how the economy is doing, all these things that are difficult to predict. But the closer you get to either 2034 or 2035, the less likely it is that there's going to be these large swings. So even sort of changes, like I said, this was positive news today, is that instead of 2034 insolvency date, when after that you can only pay 80% of promised benefits, based on today's report, that's 2035 and 83% of promised benefits. So it's a positive news.
Awesome. And then since that was a pretty straightforward question, I'm going to take you into kind of a question that might be a little bit more complex. So I'm going to break this down. So assume one is born in 1960 or later and full retirement age is 67 years. And if that person waits until age of 70 years to collect Social Security, which I suppose will equate to 124% of the benefit, will the 83% rate, that cut, that automatic cut, will that occur of the 124% benefit or the 100% full retirement age benefit?
That's an excellent question. So I will tell you, it's not one that I've gotten before.
Okay.
So the 83% reduction, and please take this with a grain of salt, it should be based more on where your full retirement age is what my belief would be.
Mm-hmm.
And that you could then probably add to that by delaying. I believe. I think that would be the case. I believe it should be sort of where they're expecting folks or basically or doing it on the full retirement age would be my thought. But very good question, and one that I'm happy to follow up on, because again, I learn things all the time as well, and that one's one that I haven't gotten before. So
yeah, good question. Yeah,
but,
and
can I get to the fundamental point, though? It's absolutely right to note that I think that, and this is the question I end up getting more, is that there's a difference in your benefits depending on when you retire, right? So So full retirement age is the age where your benefit is no longer reduced because you retired early, right? So folks can retire as early as age 62, but because they're basically getting benefits over a longer period of time, their benefit is reduced depending on the distance between when they retire early and when their full retirement age is. And then on the other side of that, if you wait after age 67, and like you said, go all the way up to 70, because you're getting basically the same amount of benefits over a shorter period of time, they add to your benefits. Ultimately, all of this, though, is actuarially neutral because, like I said, if you're getting benefits early, they assume they're essentially paying you the same amount of money over your lifetime. They're just doing it over a longer period of time. Or if you wait until after the full retirement age, it's actuarially neutral because you're getting essentially the same amount of benefits over a shorter period of time, which now makes me want to question my first answer on whether or not the 83% is actually for everybody.
It was a very complex question. I feel like you handled it perfectly. So, if that person that asked was an anonymous asker, so if you do want us to follow up with you, please just put your information in the chat and we can circle back. And so I did just want to ask you our next question that we had planned, which was, does Social Security add to the national debt?
So very good question, and one that's really topical lately, right? So the debt has been a bigger issue here in Washington once again, particularly over the last couple of years. But I'll go back to what I had mentioned earlier, right? Is that you have to so we have to understand how Social Security is financed in order to answer that question, right? And so, as I mentioned before, Social Security is self-financed, right? So and I'll go into a little bit more detail. So about 90% of how Social Security gets its money is coming in through the FICA tax, right? Through payroll taxes. There are other taxes that apply when we're talking about Social Security. Is that for some folks who are already in retirement, if they have other sources of retirement income, chances are good that they actually pay some type of an income tax on some of their Social Security benefits, right? So that provides about 3% of Social Security's financing. And then 7% comes from, so I mentioned there's these reserve funds, right? Is that the excess amount of money. And the reserve funds, they don't just sit there under the national mattress. They're actually invested in United States Treasury bonds that earn interest, right? And so the Treasury bonds, they return interest. So interest on the Treasury bonds, which are where the reserve funds are, that's about 7% of Social Security's financing. So all that stuff is separate from general revenue and separate from the debt, right? And so SSA is not a driver of the national debt. It simply isn't. It's a self-finance program that's separate from the rest of the federal government. And the only time you get into it a little bit is when you are talking about paying back the trust fund reserves that Social Security has already bought. So they lowered the debt previously by buying those. So it's a wash from our perspective. It's pre-financed, right? So it's already been bought. And so no, Social Security is not a driver of the national debt. And like I said, largely, well, not largely, but because of how it's financed, folks should know it's self-financed, and the vast majority of the way it's financed is through that FICA tax that's always coming in because of workers.
That's really helpful, Tom, and just very clear. I think a lot of times in the news media, you kind of hear different things, and you kind of people panic when they hear that it could be a contributor to the national debt. So thank you for clarifying that it is not. Speaking of news and what people read about Social Security, what are some of the best ways that viewers, and this will be our last question, what are some of the best ways viewers can keep up on news related to the program? And then two-parter, would you recommend that they contact their federal elected officials with their concerns about Social Security?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm biased again. So I would say that I think that AARP.org is a wonderful resource as far as Social Security information is concerned. If you go to AARP's website, you'll see a whole section specifically dedicated to Social Security. There's lots of good information on there that's constantly being updated. We have different calculators. We've got lots of other things related to, you can get your questions answered, actually. There's a Q&A tool in there. Lots of good information, I think. Again, I know I'm biased, but again, I really recommend AARP.org and the Social Security tab. And then to the follow-up question, I absolutely encourage folks to contact their members of Congress. So as Robin mentioned earlier when she introduced me, I spent time as a staffer on Capitol Hill working for a member of Congress. I will tell you, so much of the job is hearing from constituents and responding to those constituents. And frankly, one step before that, really learning from constituents and really understanding what their concerns are and how they feel about things. That's a huge part of the job. So I always recommend that folks should reach out to their elected officials, send them emails, give them a phone call. They are really built around the idea of hearing from their constituents. And and you don't have to be a policy expert to talk about it. You just, frankly, the most valuable stories are just how important Social Security is to you, how much, how much you probably know how it's going to be important to your children and your grandchildren. And those types of personal stories, I always recommend people reach out to their elected officials and share those stories. You don't have to be an expert. You just have to tell them how important it is to you, and that, you want to see Congress make changes to Social Security that'll make sure that the program will continue to be solvent and adequate for, decades and decades to come.
Amazing. And as Tom was talking, I just put the website into the chat for the AARP's Social Security page. So if folks want to check that out after we're finished, please feel free to go to that link. There's some really good stuff on there. And with that, we are at the end of our questions for you. And Tom, I didn't know if there's anything you wanted to leave us with, any last comments before we hand back to Robin?
Well, so let me, once again, I just want to thank you so much for having me on tonight. I really appreciate it. I hope there was good information for folks. I think that my AARP Indiana colleagues are a wonderful resource, and AARP Indiana, a wonderful resource for folks in a state that I just came out of visiting. So like I said, I just really appreciate it. I wish there was some way that, actually I shouldn't say that because that's about me receiving tenderloins for being on the show. I won't. I'm sorry. I shouldn't even have said that. But like I said, just thanks so much for letting me be here. I appreciate it.
Thanks,
We appreciate
Tom.
you. Thank you, Tom.
And with that, we're going to hand back to Robin, if she'll join us back on the screen to close us out. Thank you, Tom.
So thank you, Emily and Addison, and just a huge shout out and thanks to Tom for taking time out of this evening to share his expertise with us. And I just want to personally say that, Tom, your expertise is immense and impressive. So thank you. Just a quick reminder that you can find the recording of today's program along with our previous episodes at www.aarp.org/IN. And because it takes a village, please spread the word about the event series within your networks, whether that's by word of mouth or on your social media channels or both. So in closing, I also want to give a big thanks to all of you who participated tonight and wish you a great rest of your week. Thank you.